Thank you all for being here. I'm Dick Calloway, president of the Tryon History Museum. We welcome everyone. You can save your applause for the speaker. We'll get them beforehand now. This is the Tales of Tryon. It's brought to you by the History Museum and made possible through the generosity of the Polk County Community Foundation.
Yes.
Our speaker today doubtless needs no introduction, but I'm going to give him a brief one anyway, as a means of thanking him. He has been Andy Haynes has been a steadfast friend and loyal supporter of the museum from its early days, he and his wife Linda. And he's one who's believed in and helped promote our mission, and we appreciate it. Andy's practiced law in Tryon for over 50 years. It doesn't look possible. He knows something about aging that I don't. But he's also made a mark while doing this as a scholar, a speaker, a storyteller, civic leader, collector of lore. Now his topic today deals with his great-grandmother, Emma Payne Erskine. Emma Payne Erskine was the original title of his talk. It was too long to get in our promotional material, so I had to condense it. But his talk was Emma Payne Erskine. His title is Emma Payne Erskine, One Woman Among Many, Important in the History of Tryon. I'm telling that because, and he may want to tell it again. If he does, that's fine, but I'm telling it because I think it really was a very appropriate title. Ms. Erskine, of course, was a leader. She set the mold for many to follow. And many who followed were women. I think one of the most interesting, one of the most intriguing things about Tryon's history is the number of women who have played very influential roles. Julia Calhoun's nodding her head. I may have her make a talk on that one. I think Ms. Erskine's most lasting legacy was probably the role she played in making Tryon a cultural center that gained an international reputation. But she had many descendants, many of them literal, but others what I would call spiritual. Many of the people who followed her were inspired by her and joined to her in her spirit of cultural advancement and civic responsibility. So, at this point, I will let Andy take it from here, our speaker today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dick. You only stole part of my thunder.
I couldn't steal it all if I tried.
I appreciate that. Two housekeeping matters. I have to also thank James Little, wherever you are in the back there, the tech bureau, who had the next to impossible task of taking these pictures that I had gathered over the years and put them into a PowerPoint presentation. He didn't commit Harry as a result of that, but I almost did. Getting these things out of my computer, but there was some spirit that was keeping me from getting that done properly, but James saved my life on that. And also, I need to thank Dr. Gloria Underwood, who is greatly qualified to do the job of pressing the buttons to make the slides change. That's something I can't multitask on. The past programs here at the Tryon History Museum talks have really been a lot of fun, and many of you in the audience have done those talks, and I say it's your turn to throw the rotten tomatoes at me. And some of them are sitting on the front row with their boiled vegetables to do that. But I want to thank all of you for coming to hear my tale. It is lengthy because it's impossible to cram the life of a dynamic woman into a short period of time. So I'll just say in advance, if you have to leave, be my guest. I won't hold it against you for exiting if this thing goes on too long. Dick asked me to talk about my great-grandmother, who history of our town and this community. But as he mentioned, I say that Emma was an influential member of this community among others, because it's important for us to think about the other women in this community from the past and also to the present. I don't want to leave anyone out, so I'm not going to talk about the present, but we know who they are. They are the executive directors and presidents and folks. A little closer to the microphone, that's fine.
A lot closer, yeah.
Okay, I hope you heard part of what I said. But the other influential women in this community, but the shout out, at least initially, will go to the Leduc sisters, who came down here from Minnesota and started the Lanier Library. How could we forget Eleanor Vance and Charlotte Yale, who started the Tryon Toy Makers that's still going on today through Julia's efforts. We think about Mrs. Masinovich, who's made such an impression and a lasting effect on the musical talents of this community. We think about Della Jackson, who formed the Stony Knoll Library, a dynamic and very effective woman. We think of Sally Cathy, who promoted the mountain crafts around here, started Blue Ridge Weavers Club and ran that for many years and fostered those industries in the mountains. We can't forget about the ladies of the Tryon Garden Club who saved Pearson's Falls. So those are all good subjects for future tales, talks. Tonight, however, I'm going to be concentrating on that one person that I know something about. My grandmother, Emma Payne Erskine. The title of my talk is Emma, with apologies to Jane Austen. So there's a confusion about who we're talking about. And this, in general, is a story of migration north to south. It's the story of a Wisconsin woman and her family who first came to Tryon in an area 135 years ago. And during their tenure here, directly or indirectly influenced the creation of the Tryon Country Club, the Congregational Church, the Tryon Fine Arts Center, Rogers Park, and who were associated with the early history of the Lanier Library in Pearson's Falls. In particular, it presents the journey of that woman from housewife and mother to a formidable participant in a number of endeavors. Sometime back, a friend called me up and alerted me to an item on eBay that I needed to check out. The auction offering, a single note card inscribed, "Best wishes," signed Emma Payne Erskine, at the buy it now price of $35. I said, that's astounding. I said, why would anyone want to pay for the autograph of my great-grandmother? I then realized I needed to go into my attic to gather the materials to produce my own historical narrative and answer that question for the benefit of my family and my community. In this presentation, I alternate this between a series of scenes in the stages of the life of Emma, and then provide some historical background to what was going on in those episodes during her life, and that will advance the story. The first scene that I will give you is 5:30 p.m., Monday, September 22nd, 1884. The Illinois Central train was still in the Great Central Depot on Lake Street in Chicago. So Emma had a final chance to go over the list and to consider what may have been forgotten or left undone in the complex plan for the Erskine family's departure for the exploratory trip south. Dinner had been arranged at 6:30 in the dining car, and she hoped the bill of fare would be equal to that at the Harvey houses they had enjoyed on previous train trips to the West Coast. Her husband, Charles, 37, and three little boys, Alfred, 8, Harold, 7, and Ralph Four were now ensconced in the drawing room sleeping car, which would be their little home until they changed trains downstate in Cairo, Illinois, tomorrow. With voluminous trunks and boxes, enough for the 5-month sojourn were in the baggage car checked through. Their home, the Oaks, on a farm 2 miles outside of Racine, Wisconsin, was closed and servants furloughed for that period, concluding that there was nothing else to be done. Her next thought was, what will come of this trip south? So the history behind that was Emma Payne Erskine was born May 9th, 1854. She was 30 years old at the time of that train trip. She was the daughter of Alfred Payne, 1815 to 1893, one of Chicago's earliest professional artists, known for his portraits of various college presidents and prominent businessmen and family members. Here's Emma at 16, painted by her father. His final post was as a teacher at Chicago's Art Institute. Her grandfather Payne, from Bristol, England, immigrated to New York City, where he served as a priest in an Episcopal church. Her mother, Olive, was a descendant of Increase Mather, president of Harvard College, 1685 to 1701. The Payne family felt that New York was too fashionable, so they moved on to Ohio and finally to Racine, Wisconsin. Her parents, Olive and Alfred, were well-educated and interesting people, and though the profession of an artist brought in little money in those post-Civil War days, their home was a mecca for cultivated and intellectual people, so their daughter Emma grew up surrounded by people who valued the ideas and the arts. Here is Emma, posed by her father in the role of a heroine of a Milton poem. From an early age, she liked working with her hands, showed a talent for storytelling, and had an abundant energy for all kinds of creative pursuits. At 19, she married Charles E. Erskine of Racine, Wisconsin, son of a partner of J.I.K.'s threshing machine company, an important manufacturer of farm equipment. He had money, a comfortable position in his father's firm, and serious interest in music and intellectual pursuits. After the marriage, they built a house which reflected their personalities and outlook. The elite of Main Street, Racine, thought that they were very odd to choose to build 2 miles out of town because all the best people lived on Main Street. The place was really a farm with pastures, a large cow barn, a tenant farmer's cottage, a stable for horses, and the house itself stood on a bluff and was surrounded with huge oak trees. Of course, it was named the Oaks. It was a big 3-story wooden house garnished with some of the gingerbread so admired at that time. It included a music room and a schoolroom. The grounds of the house afforded Charles the opportunity to pursue his first passion. He was a real working gardener and talented landscape architect. He had his Scotch gardener, Mr. McClure. He and his Scotch gardener, Mr. McClure, kept the Oaks ablaze all summer with flowers and the kitchen garden overflowing with vegetables and cut flowers. When the Wisconsin weather did not permit gardening, which was too much of the year for Charles's taste, he spent his time in the music room at the piano and pipe organ, indulging his other passion, music. While all this gardening and music was going on for Charles, Emma was a very busy woman running their house, entertaining guests, and generally fulfilling the duties of a Victorian-age wife and mother. She had many, many talents, innate talents, painting, sewing, and carpentry. She had a great literary and artistic sense and a deep concern for social justice. While it was true that she had found outlet for these abilities as a founder of the YWCA in Racine and as a teacher of a large Sunday school class, at this stage of life, the main focus of her talents had to be her family, her household, not herself. self-actualization would have to wait. So what did it mean to run a house of about 20 rooms and a family eventually numbering 8, plus a constant stream of visiting relatives and friends? It took efficient supervision and a good staff. Emma had a talent for handling servants, consisting of the cook, the nursemaid, the laundress, a housemaid, waitress, a second girl, a coachman, a gardener. The work was hard, even with such a staff. Besides directing all of this household activity, Emma was running the schoolroom at the Oaks, a bona fide schoolroom with blackboards and desks. She taught 4 of her 6 children at home until they were ready for prep school. Of course, given Emma not all of it was intellectual, she put on plays. She taught them all to sew, to wield a hammer and saw. She gained their attention and molded their outlook with her vivid imagination, telling wild stories of the Emma-invented mythological answer grass. This strange creature came to life when, for the Christmas pageant, she constructed a 4-foot-high grasshopper-like animal with pressed glass sugar bowl lids for eyes attached to a sort of chariot made from a cradle on wheels. The image of her answer grass and Charles's pipe organ are instructive in understanding the difference between Charles and Emma. He was Scottish, New England, impeccable, reserved, and Victorian, in a word, classical. He began his letters to her, "My dear Emma," and signed them C.E. Erskine. She was joyous, uninhibited, artistic, and emotional, in a word, romantic. Her correspondence, "My dear, dear, I send you great love, my beloved." This dichotomy of personalities created some tensions in the marriage. There were the inevitable heated arguments that occurred between the classical and the romantic. They were different people, certainly, but truly loved and were proud of each other. The pipe organ and the answer grass found a way to be complementary. And so, being attuned to accommodating the needs and concerns of the other, Emma and Charles were aboard that train headed south. In the earlier years, the train had been headed out west to Pasadena, California, where Charles had purchased a house on Grand Avenue in the land of sunshine. The gardener and Charles hated the Wisconsin climate, the long winters and the wind blowing off Lake Michigan. Each year, they traveled elsewhere to escape the harsh Midwestern cold. But Emma never really enjoyed fashionable Pasadena. She was extroverted, but not a socialite. She cared little for pretty clothes and did not like snobbery, so Pasadena was an accommodation to Charles. Knowing Emma's social discomfort, Charles came up with another idea. Back on April 25th, 1882, Charles had written his sister expressing some disappointment with California and saying, "We may hope to spend a portion of the winter in the South, say Tennessee or North Carolina. I presume the winters there are somewhat like those in Italy, much disagreeable weather, but many more bright days and sunny days than we get here." That earlier hope was being realized in this September 1884 as Emma sat on the train wondering what would come of this trip south. The next scene, April 24th, 1885, was a glorious spring morning. The gentle breeze was from the western mountains coming across the Packlet River, and the ascending sun accentuated the varied topography of the greening hills. The birds were chirping and singing. In the distance, a dog barked. Emma sat in a rocker on the expansive veranda of McAvoy's Inn, enjoying the peaceful beginning of the day and reflecting on the events since the departure from the Chicago station so many months ago. For her, this southern experiment had created interesting possibilities for the future, and she hoped that the same would be true for Charles. Now here's the history behind that scene. Emma and her family had traveled to Biloxi, Mississippi, to Tallahassee, to St. Augustine, Florida. Early in 1885, they learned of a place in North Carolina called Asheville, which was becoming known as a resort. Unfortunately, they learned after their arrival that because of the fresh air, it was also becoming a center for the care and treatment of consumptives, those suffering from the dreaded disease tuberculosis. They found the many invalids populating the sanatorium and even the Battery Park Hotel a most depressing situation, considering that recently it had been theorized that the disease was contagious. It was too early to head back to Racine, to the winter, but a lady at the hotel told them about a place she had just visited, an old plantation house turned in down at the foot of the mountains. She said it's called McAvoy's Inn. It's near the village of Tryon, not far from the South Carolina line. It took a venturesome spirit to get there because the railroad was not finished, but anything to get away from the consumptives. So Emma and Charles and the three boys set off by carriage from Asheville as far as Hendersonville. There, the tracks had been finished on July 4th, 1879, running from Spartanburg, South Carolina to Tryon in 1877. And then up over the Saluda Mountains via Pace's Gap, a miracle of construction that took years to complete, with huge vertical rock cuts that dwarf trains, steep grades, and 50 exceptional curves. Over this engineering marvel, the steam train took the Erskine family 800 feet down into the lowlands to Tryon City, a town newly incorporated and numbering less than 24 houses, in a county of 7,500 souls. The little town was picturesque, but little more than a foothill settlement with few commercial establishments other than Ballinger's Dry Goods, 2 general stores, and a blacksmith shop. The train depot was the center of activity both physically and socially. The 2 big events of the day were the arrival of the Carolina Special from the Low Country in the morning and its return on the way back down the mountain in the afternoon. Passengers debarking were met by wagons and buggies with drivers filling the air with shouts and cries and popping their whips to attract fares to take them and their trunks to the hotels and boarding houses. Boys carrying trays of fried chicken and coleslaw and lemonade hurried to the train to refresh passengers who were going on through. Everyone in town, including the children and dogs, met the train for the excitement. The Erskine family arrived to this reception and found their way along the 1.5-mile carriage ride up and down rugged hills over water to McAvoy's Inn, a big, rambling home hidden away in the Packard River Valley with broad verandas looking over rich alluvial farmland and hemmed in by high wooded mountains. It's where Mimosa Inn stands today. The inn, they were to discover, had been the plantation house of Columbus Mills. After the Civil War, in 1868, Dr. and Mrs. Leland McAvoy and family came from Pittsburgh, and also seeking the area's beauty and climate, they bought the property and renamed it. Through his efforts and welcoming spirit, Dr. McAvoy was responsible for the locality known as Lynn, named for his son, becoming the tourist center for lovers and of nature and out-of-doors, about which the Erskines had heard from a lady in Asheville. Their arrival was only 4 years after that of the McAvoy's most famous guest, Sidney Lanier, who had come seeking the curative climate and had died nearby in September of 1891. The Erskines, too, were the beneficiaries of the McAvoy's welcoming spirit, and they felt an instant rapport with their hosts and the many other interesting and well-connected northern transplants they encountered from the beginning of their visit. In addition to being socially amenable, life at the inn was healthy and invigorating. A day for Charles and the boys was divided between long tramps and longer carriage drives and rides along bridle paths that wound everywhere through the valley and over the mountains. While the family was tramping, Emma spent her time with any and all of the local people she could find. Their simplicity, honesty, and total lack of veneer were qualities she loved, even though she heard stories of their feuds and stubbornness and intemperance. She learned much about their culture. What fascinated her the most was their language and speech patterns, which were nothing like anything she'd ever encountered before. It was musical, soft, and lazily enunciated, so unlike the harsh twang of the Midwest and North. She listened to it for hours throughout her whole southern stay and became proficient in its imitation, which will figure into her career later on. Her long stay at McAvoy's gave her time for pursuing another of her passions that had been submerged in the hectic and busy life of her scene. At the back of the inn, there was a row of slave cabins left over from the plantation life of 20 years past. In 1885, these were still occupied by formerly enslaved people who had been servants of the Columbus Mills family. With her uninhibited personality and egalitarian outlook, she found these neighbors to be friendly and much fun to be around. And so she painted their portraits in water and pastel. There was Uncle Paldo Mills, born in Africa and sold to Mr. Columbus Mills. He was a famous local preacher who had no idea of his age, except that he remembered when the stars fell, recalling a meteor shower that occurred in 1833. There was Aunt Phoebe Mills, his wife. It was said that she cherished the silk bandana she wore, which had formerly been a gift of her owner. There was the old fish trap maker, who plied the packet with his reed trap and gig. Several of Paldo's children also sat for Emma. It is clear from some 13 renderings done without a hint of condensation that the stories, attitudes, and dialect of a black family made as much of an impression on Emma as her paints made on the canvases. The Erskines were enchanted by the experience at McAvoy's. The trying climate, scenery, and people held them there that spring longer than they expected to stay. But spring was coming to Wisconsin too, and Emma knew Charles would be anxious to get home to supervise the rejuvenating gardens and grounds. Emma too had reason to get back. Her fourth child, it would be her first daughter, would be due before September 1st. And here's the next scene. May 8, 1892 was a fine spring day at the Oaks. It was the kind of day that made one not hate the Wisconsin weather and was made all the more beautiful and joyous for Emma because earlier the postman had delivered 2 letters that made her heart leap. Both letters were postmarked Lynn, Tryon, Lynn, North Carolina, with one dated April 27th and the other dated April 29th, 1892. They were from Charles, who was traveling with their son Harold, and her husband was bursting with enthusiasm about his long-delayed but long-anticipated return to McAvoy's Inn after 7 years. He wrote, "There is so much to write, and I hardly know where to begin. I spend so much of my time in rushing around over old familiar ground that I leave only leisure for eating and sleeping. An acquaintance running an Asheville rooming house wants us all to come down and board with her next winter. But Asheville cannot catch us when there is so superior a winter climate down here in Lynn. Harold, his son, has a companion of his own size in Mrs. Sidney Lanier's boy. The boys played tennis last evening until 7:30. How is that for April? There are only a few new houses, but those are good additions to the beauty of this place. I was wishing this noon that we had you all down here at this place instead of having been wandering about as we have, but the wandering has served to show me the advantages of this locality over most others. His second letter continued the rhapsody. I have been so occupied by rambling about among the beauties of this region that I have scarcely found leisure to write. The valley is now one great flower garden. I haven't seen so many in one locality outside of California. Charles's epistle continued with graphic descriptions of the flora, and then came the sentences that were like a bombshell to Emma. He said, "A knoll which I have taken a fancy for as a building site just this side of Mr. Garrison's is covered in rhododendron. The reason I have a liking for this particular spot is that it is elevated above the valley and juts into it, giving a view up and down the valley of the surrounding mountains." Here's the history behind that scene. After what might be called Emma's Southern Spring in 1885, life for her had returned to the conventional and more predictable pursuits of the Oaks and Pasadena. And she kept on producing babies. Violet in 1885, Malcolm in 1888, Susan in 1889. In those years, Family Matters and Winters in fashionable Pasadena, where Susan was born, dominated her life. Her duties left little time for other creative endeavors, but she had never once forgotten McAvoy's adventure. As time magnified its memory, the opportunity to be unconventional and part of a less tame, rustic environment seemed irresistible. The letter from Charles that we read offered a great promise that things might change for the better. Here's the next scene. Friday, March 21st, 1902. It was the annual meeting of the Lanier Club being held in Tryon at the Congregational Church on Melrose Avenue, a simple wood frame building originally built for the Methodists whose church had failed. The ladies of the club were pleased to have one of their own, a past officer, present the featured address entitled Moral Responsibility of the Novel. After introductory remarks, the club's president, Mrs. Mistledines, introduced the speaker, Payne, Erskine. Here's the history behind that event. Much had occurred in the creative and personal life of Emma from the receipt of Charles's letter in the spring of 1892 until she stepped forward to address the Lanier Club ladies 10 years later. To the joy of everyone in the family, Charles did purchase that fancied hill which projected into the Packlet Valley and commanded a view of the whole panorama of the mountains. The house was begun in 1894. George Vanderbilt was finishing his mansion at Biltmore, and its junior architect, Richard Sharp Smith, was available to assist Charles in planning and work, as were some of its artisans. But Charles's home was done in an informal arts and crafts style, using rough quarry rocks instead of dressed stone, reflective of the rural and sylvan setting of Tryon. It was called Minco, referencing the nearby community of Lynn that had so attracted the Erskines back in 1885. Consistent with Charles's passion, he designed garden terraces on the steep hillsides. His planning and supervision of every foot of the curving rock walls and plantings gave him several years of pleasure. But in his planning he was not unmindful of Emma's interests. While building the grand home, Charles had constructed halfway down the hill another smaller house, which was to be a studio for Emma. It offered a new world of possibilities for her. Therein were installed easels, paints, brushes, and canvases, a piano, and a new device that would absorb Emma as completely as the gardens would Charles. It was a typewriter, and it was well used. Emma and Charles laughed when he recorded a conversation overheard between two of his rock masons who had been working near Emma's studio. The workman could hear the constant tapping away. One of them had said, "I hear Mr. Erskine's a real millionaire."
The reply, well, where do you reckon he gets his money? And he said, I expect his old woman stomps it out on that darn machine. Early days of counterfeiting. In the pastoral retreat at Tryon, each of the family grew to love it more and more. Life seemed freer there than anywhere else they'd lived. As the older children went off to preparatory school and college, Emma could and did immerse herself in the activities she loved and in the life of the new community. She painted china, flowers, and landscapes, and even scenery for amateur plays at the newly erected Dow's Opera House on Melrose. She became one of the earliest workers for the Lanier Club, and from time to time, and from the time of her arrival in town, holding offices and undertaking responsibilities in that gathering of the most important and capable women of Tryon. The club, formed in about 1889 by recent arrivals, the Leduc sisters, was the intellectual center of town life, and its object was to provide not only books, but social opportunities and fun for residents and the interesting and sophisticated winter visitors who began coming, as had the Erskines, from colder climates. In the 5 years between 1898 and 1902, the typewriter had been busy, as she delivered more than 12 presentations to the assemblies of the Lanier members. The topics were eclectic, ranging from literary and poetic readings to papers explicating the imaginative faculty or the works of Lanier or Robert Louis Stevenson. She once addressed a club symposium on how Tryon might be saved from the dangers of careless TB patients, a subject with which she was familiar given her stay in Asheville in 1885. Her involvement in the civic affairs grew beyond the small stage in Tryon as she became increasingly involved in the affairs of the Federation of Women's Clubs, a national organization that focused on and dealt with the concerns and problems of women in the Victorian age. Lack of economic freedom, sexist laws, disenfranchisement, depression, and gender discrimination were the topics of discussion and investigation by the membership. Association with such an organization was a large, although not illogical or surprising step for a person of Emma's spirited and capable intellect. The result of Emma's newfound opportunities, exposure, and experience in and outside of Tryon, not to mention the typewriter in her new studio, was the publication of Boston's Little Brown and Company, by Boston's Little Brown and Company in 1901, of her novel, When the Gates Lift Up Their Heads. This was a treatment of black-white relations during the Southern Reconstruction period of the 1870s. The Chicago Evening Post review said, the story is stirring. There are certain scenes in the book which are not to be excelled in characterization, and the new author is to be congratulated upon the humor and pathos, the sympathy and sureness of touch. The black protagonists in this book, Josephus and his wife, Mammy Clarissa, with their nobility and plain wisdom, appear to be drawn from the old Uncle Paldo and Aunt Phoebe Mills, painted and befriended by Emma 16 years earlier at McAvoy's. The dialect she heard from them resonates throughout the story. Them folks from the north going to fix up the old place and take in vocals. But it was used in order to be authentic and not to demean, as the overarching theme presented was of dignity and right. It was her views on her own moral novel that she was about to discuss with the ladies of the Lanier Club meeting, and it marked a major milestone in the accomplishments of her life. Next scene. August 9th, 1908 was a low point for Emma. The Racine, Wisconsin summer had been unseasonably hot, breathless, and scorching. In the past few days, it had cooled with nightly rains beginning on the 31st of July. But the weather was the least of her worries. That afternoon, her sister-in-law, Emma Crosby, had come to the Oaks in Racine to call. The gesture was perhaps well-meaning, but Emma knew her sister-in-law to be critical of Emma, petty at best and worst, pathologically jealous of Emma's relationship with Charles Erskine, who was both Emma's husband and Mrs. Crosby's brother. Because of the events of the past 30 days, Emma was just too tired and depressed to deal with a pesky in-law whom she thought bore her no goodwill. At the risk of being rude, she sent forth her sons, Alfred 32 and Harold 31, to issue the message, "We're sorry, mother's indisposed." And here's the history behind that scene. Indisposed. Emma was by nature optimistic, positive, and romantic. Those traits notwithstanding, circumstances of life can be overpowering. For the past several years, with and without husband Charles, she had traveled with various of the 6 children in Europe. That gang's drinking bottles of wine directly from the bottle. That's the kind of people I'm behind. Much of the time she was not well, and she spent long periods recuperating in Austria and Switzerland. An operation in 1907 had been successful and gave her hope of physical and spiritual regeneration. If she had possessed the fear, pessimism, and superstition of a less modern mind, the eclipse of the sun that occurred in the Wisconsin sky on Sunday, June 28, 1908, 42 days earlier that summer, that would have been, for her, an ominous portent of an impending spiritual relapse. The weakness that Charles had been experienced since June, and which had sent him to the hospital in Kenosha, Wisconsin, turned out on the date after the eclipse to be inoperable cancer. The death watch lasted 12 days. By July 2nd, Emma and 5 of the 6 children had been brought from afar to gather at the bedside. Charles bore his fate with characteristic grace and calm, signed his will, and settled his affairs. At 5 a.m. on July 10th, weak but clear, he bid his family goodbye, demonstrating faith, nobility, and strength of character that were an inspiration to his children as he took each by the hand. He then lay back, awaiting death, which came 5:45 p.m. that day. Inspirational as these things were, they took a toll. Son Alfred said in his tears of grief, "We have lost our balance wheel." Son Malcolm, 20, summed up the loss to the family. "We have no one now to tell us what to do." Emma, at 55, was suffering from both of these problems after she had been married to Charles for 36 years since she was 19. It was true that she and Charles had had their difficulties in marriage. They were different people, as described earlier. He ordered, controlled, and directed. She intuitive, spontaneous, and free-spirited. The right brain married to the left brain. In her pettiness, sister-in-law Emma Crosby saw Emma Payne Erskine's distress as Emma Payne Erskine is much depressed and has much to realize her loss. She is far from well. In fact, the deeper malaise may have stemmed from Emma's concerns about where she stood in the world following Charles's death and how she would go forward. Charles's will was described by his sister and by his youngest daughter as fair and just. That fair and just will, perhaps reflective of the time before full rights to and regard for women, left his considerable financial assets equally to Emma and the 6 children. In other words, Emma was left with 1/7 of the financial resources that she and Charles had enjoyed for support during their marriage. The real estate holdings, the Oaks and Racine, and Lincoat and Tryon, did go to Emma, but of course there were extensive maintenance costs associated with those properties. With all the other things on her mind, she wondered how she might manage. Next scene. Friday, October 19, 1917. Dawned a rainy fall morning in Tryon. The fat pine in the fireplace at the studio popped as the blaze began to warm the small house against the dampness. Perhaps the aroma would be restorative. Emma had not slept well. She did not want her restlessness to disturb her husband, who was still asleep. So she left the bed quite early and lit the fire in the outer room. She was anxious because her beloved son, Harold, had joined the American Expeditionary Force and was headed to France in that gruesome war. The rain was going to make for a dreary day, but she remembered how the country folk said rain makes the fall colors all the more brilliant. She harbored the hope that some similar good would come from her son's experience in Europe. After all, this was life, and it was filled with both the beautiful and the terrible. She had experienced both. But here's the history behind that scene. Charles's death 9 years before had been a devastating blow to Emma. As the boys had said, he was the family's balance wheel and its director, even though she had not always followed his instructions. The loss of personal support as well as the financial security were immense challenges. But Emma was a woman of character and resourcefulness, and she knew she had to face and overcome these difficulties. Even Emma was practical enough to understand that her economic issues needed to be resolved first. Owning 2 grand houses was a luxury she could not now afford. Tryon was where she most wanted to be. The Oaks in Racine, used mainly as the summer residence, was sold, and she moved permanently to Lincote on the hill in Tryon. Tryon was becoming a more developed and prosperous community. As the railway brought more winter visitors, and more winter visitors became permanent residents, the churned-up, muddy, rutted roads and sparse habitation found earlier by the Erskines in the 1880s became all-weather thoroughfares and neighborhoods with telephones and municipal services. The village had many more commercial establishments, a bank, missile-dodge drugstore, real estate firms, and a hotel. The Lanier Club had erected a permanent home on Melrose, and earlier in 1908, prior to his death, Charles had constructed the new Congregational Church on Melrose. Given a growing Tryon, Emma realized that her most abundant assets, the lands Charles left her outright, would be a source of financial support. With the Oaks proceeds, she became one of Tryon's earliest developers, building and selling houses on her property along Highway 108. It's known as Mosley Hall across from the Triangle Stop. And the owner of it may be here this evening, I'm not sure. Along 108 from the town limits to the entrance to Lincote. From those sales, money was available to buy more land. While this entrepreneurial activity was going on, Emma was not neglecting her artistic side. Given the accomplishments of publishing her 1901 book and a 1905 volume of epic poetry, she turned again in a determined focus to writing novels. Her great success was The Mountain Girl, first serialized in Ladies' Home Journal and later published by Little Brown and Company in 1911 as a book and went through at least 13 printings. It's a love story of the North Carolina mountains, where an English aristocrat comes in search of help, and he finds it and more. Happiness and usefulness among the local people, and young Cassandra, who embodies his ideal of womanhood. Dialogue in the book directly echoes the accents of the mountain folk that so fascinated Emma on her first trip south a quarter of a century earlier. She learned the language well, as illustrated in the exchange between Aunt Sally and the fugitive Frail in The Mountain Girl. Come on up here, Frail. It's only me. I allow you must have something to say for yourself. I ain't nothing to say. He were mean, and he dated. He dated. You know I hain't seen nobody to hurt yuns, that I tell ye. Most telling about the attitude of the author and reflective of her intensity is the discussion in that book between the local business James Towers and his feisty, determined wife, Betty. These two knew the visiting English aristocrat was growing fond of Cassandra, the flower of the mountains, beautiful in nature and soul. They also knew she had earlier promised to marry in hopes of redeeming him, one of the wildest and most reckless of the mountain boys, the lawbreaker, moonshiner, and murderer, Frail. The stuffy bishop reflected on Cassandra's fate with her affianced, Frail. So the bishop says, yes, it seems terrible, but if she has Frail's children, she will be able to do more for them than her mother has done for her, and they will have her inheritance. So her life can't be wholly wasted, even if she is not able to give up her aspirations. And the bishop's wife, Betty, says, James Towers, because you're a man that you can talk so. I'm ashamed, and you a bishop. I wish. Betty's eyes were full of angry tears. I only wish you were a woman. Slowly improve the race by bearing children, giving them her inheritance. How would she bear them? Year after year, ill-fed, half-clothed, slaving to raise enough to hold their souls in their bodies, bringing them into the world for a brute who knows only enough to make corn whiskey, to sell it and drink it, and reproduce his kind, when she knows all the time what ought to be. Oh, James, think of it. Even at the best, James, for her it would be death and life. There can be no doubt who was the inspiration for the bishop's wife, Betty. The book was rapidly followed by 3 more novels: Girl of the Blue Ridge, that's the picture there, Joyful Heatherby, The Eye of Dread, and A Girl of the Blue Ridge. All works, as might be imagined, featured strong heroines who successfully deal with the vicissitudes of life, and the books were well received. Between sessions at her typewriter, Emma continued her career in real estate. She acquired the Caruth Tract, a large farm on Mill Creek in the valley below Melrose Mountain. She bought for subdivision a high ridge above Skyuka Road and property adjoining Harmon Field called the Pacolet Plantation. Because Tryon was a resort with no golf links, she cleared a portion of the Melrose Valley Tract and hired golf architect Donald Ross to design a course. She gave the 54 acres to Tryon Country Club, which was formed in April 28, 1916, by Emma and 6 local businessmen, with Emma as the major stockholder. She reasoned that if the club were successful, her retained property surrounding the course would become all the more valuable as subdivided lots. These projects energized her and gave her an opportunity to utilize a broad range of talents. But like her heroines, she faced challenges even during the most productive period of her life. She was lonely, and after 36 years of marriage, missed having someone in her life. Then, perhaps as a symbol of that concern, in 1915, Lincote, the magnificent home that she and Charles had built and loved, burned, leaving only the charred stone walls and the archway as reminders of the haven it had been for Charles, for Emma and her family. Following that loss, on Christmas Eve of that year, Emma's beloved daughter-in-law, Barbara, wife of her son Ralph, and daughter of Emma's best friend Elia Petey, died at her Connecticut home of blood poisoning. Babby left a grieving husband and 3 infant children in the days before penicillin. The indomitable Emma, leaving no time for her own grief, went into action. She immediately went up to Stamford, Connecticut to help with her grandchildren. She cared for them as only a grandmother can until a nursery governess could be found. The best was made of the situation. Then Emma, again, like her heroines, then for Emma, again, like her heroines, something good came out of tragedy. While in Connecticut, she visited New York City. There she happened to meet an old friend of the family from Racine, whom she had not seen for many years, Mr. Cecil Corwin. He was an old bachelor, gentle, artistic, witty, and a draftsman architect who had worked with Frank Lloyd Wright. When she returned to Tryon, he came down for a visit, and before long, the two lonely people were married. Emma, in her usual inventive mind, had visions of his designing and building many houses on her land and making a lot of money. With Lincoat gone, they moved into her cozy studio halfway down the hill to begin their new life together. Now, on that rainy fall morning, as we saw in the scene, Emma enjoyed the fire. Cecil was still sleeping in the bedroom. The next scene, Monday, December 6th, 1922. Darkness was falling. Emma was at her desk at the Wren's Nest, a cottage across Highway 108 from Lincoat, which still stands, site which she had built back in the teens and sold to her sister Bertha. She now had to rent it back. With the day ending, she had finally finished typing, and what she estimated was the 20th letter written over the past 3 years to her son Ralph. And like the others, it was no short, newsy note. At 4 large pages, single-spaced, 2,400 words long, it had taken all day to pound out with her one good hand. With all her force of personality and the intensity of someone wronged, she aimed her salvo. To Ralph, she says, "I want my property back in my hands. It will give me interest in life and will be to me a source of help and satisfaction to carry out my plans. It's not being managed in the best way, not managed at all. Your trust is a wonderful instrument for rendering me powerless. There will, in all probability, be enough to keep the old lady a few years longer. I do not like to live under that thought, and with all due respect to you and your opinions, I will not. Experience has taught me that you are wrong about the value of building on my land. The houses I have built were what I have lived on for all these last years. They have been sold one after the other to keep me supplied with my income. These houses were built for that reason. I think it would be far better to allow me to take the chance and see what can be done in the way of increasing my assets by building on some of my beautiful sites and selling. It's my opinion that I should be left alone with this property. With judicious handling, it should be made to carry itself an increasing value. Of course, I would have to borrow. Everyone does. And it's the only way to progress. Way progressive work is carried on. You know it, and you do it yourself. I know there are endless arguments you might bring up, and all my past mistakes with them. But is there anyone during these past 8 years has made no mistakes, or who has lost nothing? Do you think I've learned nothing by my own blunders? That I should be put now in a sort of straitjacket? I shall make no large borrowings at a time, but will borrow only so much as will accomplish the one purpose for which it was made. Oh, Ralph, give me back my own. Stop distrusting me and fearing me. I am all right and can do right with no fear of loss. I shall be very careful and conservative. I have learned my lesson. It is time you willingly and lovingly give me back my own and let me do as I think best with it. I really do not care to live on unless you do. It is not a terrible thing to do. You will yourself feel freer and be glad when it is done, and you have thrown off anxiety and fear of me. Her strongest appeal to the son and father of 4 was inspired. She wrote, "When my mother was living, she was at Sister Elsie's, and her little grandson Philip was playing near her with his blocks. In packing her trunk, she for the second time knocked down his buildings with her skirts. She said, "Excuse me, Philip." His reply, "Can't excuse you, Grandma, but I love you." It is the same with me. You and your trust are knocking down my blocks. I can't excuse you, but I love you. Not your trust, but you I love. She mailed a letter to Ralph the next morning and hoped for the best. And here's the history behind that scene. Developers by nature are optimistic risk takers. When those developers are also artistic and emotional persuasion, problems can arise. Entrepreneurs must borrow, requiring careful cash flow management. There are no successful, undisciplined, and impulsive entrepreneurs. During 1916-1918, Emma took on too much too quickly and did not manage it well. Borrowing put her assets in jeopardy, and it did not help that she was a trusting believer in the goodness of others. Faith in contractors and self-promoters was often misplaced. Imaginative, although wildly impractical, endeavors such as a tea room in the old Erskine stables and the facility for manufacturing cold cream in the gardener's quarters on Lynn Road resulted for Emma in an influx of rascals and an outflow of cash. With all the fiscal problems, physical problems followed. In 1918, she had a severe stroke that impaired the use of her left hand. Although she remained ambulatory with the aid of a cane, the recuperation further drained resources, raising the specter of foreclosure, bankruptcy, and economic ruin. Her children had been thrifty with their own inheritances. None wanted to see Emma's properties lost, so they stepped in to salvage their mother's financial wreck. They paid the debts and quieted the creditors. There was a price, however. Not trusting Emma's judgment and further management, the children persuaded their mother in August of 1918 to place all her real property holdings, by then amounting to approximately 700 acres, into a trust managed by the local bank with two of the children, Ralph and Susan, as trustees. The trust was irrevocable and required at least one of the children, trustees, to approve any action on the real property. Emma was put on a strict and disciplined budget on which her children held firm. With the tight money and Emma's impaired health, Cecil Corwin, her husband, found it necessary to return to his architecture job in New York. They were together only periodically in Tryon, New York, but remained emotionally devoted to each other. As the 1920s progressed, Emma gradually regained her physical energy, fueled by her impassioned optimism and faith in herself. That was when her numerous 20-page handwritten epistles and 2,000-word typed dissertations were fired off to Ralph. As trustee seeking a rescission of the trust and complaining of the bank's negligent management of her assets. She was particularly furious because the bank had underinsured her beloved studio, which was lost to a fire, necessitating her move to rented quarters at the Wren's Nest. The letters expressing her persistence and single-mindedness are monuments to her strength of will. Her arguments repeat those recurring leitmotifs of her life: freedom and independence. But the correspondence, coming as it did in her waning years, expressed another theme, equally representative of her character and dominant in her life, a theme that made her the appealing person that she was: romanticism. To reassure her family, she wrote on a Tryon fall day, 15 months before her death. She said, "I would rather live here in this autumn glory, sitting in a simple glass room with the sunlight streaming in and the open space all about me, looking out at the mountaintops and the masses of red and gold, making a radiance and splendor that is unimaginable, than to live in the city much, much. I even find myself pitying those not so situated. Well, everyone to his taste. I do not like streets and crowds and noise and confusion, nor trains and dirt. So don't ever be troubled about me. When you think of me, think up, not down. As I said before, trust that I am doing my best. And she continued, I'm very contented and happy here, with pleasant occupation and only enough care to keep me from remembering that I am a dog, which someone once said about the usefulness of fleas to a dog. Emma Payne Erskine died in Tryon on March 4th, 1924. She was a modern American woman in the Victorian age. She spent her life endeavoring to impact her environment and the community through art, her writing, her social activism, and her entrepreneurship. She succeeded in her art with its sympathetic depiction of the formerly enslaved. She succeeded in her writing with its convention debunking. In hindsight, as Tryon has grown, we know she succeeded in her real estate development with her vision and optimism, in her community activism, seeking fairness and right. It's interesting to note that these accomplishments were achieved during a time when societal norms were against her. All her novels were published under the nom de plume Payne Erskine to avoid any bias against female authors. Her entrepreneurial efforts found her the lone woman among numbers of businessmen. Her community work was done at a time when she could not even vote. The 15th Amendment was not passed until 1920, too late for Emma personally, but not her progeny. Emma Payne Erskine defied that convention and was clearly a woman before her time. As such, and as much as any other person, she was responsible for making Little Tryon a cultural and social center with the national reputation it enjoys. I started this talk in response to an eBay auction. Now I will turn my original question around and ask, why wouldn't somebody pay $35 for my great-grandmother's autograph? In conclusion, this is a story of a woman's journey from Wisconsin to North Carolina and its impact on Tryon. Currently visible effects of that journey, the Tryon Country Club with its green, its plaque to Emma posted there, the Tryon Country Club's National Historic Registry, the Congregational Church plaque honoring her, the portrait Judy of Violet that hangs in the Tryon Fine Arts Center, because Violet, her daughter, gave the initial money to form the Tryon Fine Arts Center in the 1960s. And the TFAC plaque honoring many of Emma's descendants as original founders of the Tryon Fine Arts Center. Rogers Park plaque, her daughter Susan gave that property to my brother. My brother contributed that property to the town to form Rogers Park. And the Rogers Park plaque commemorating those events. And finally, we see that life moves on and brings us to today. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. We're going to make time for a brief question and answer session in case anyone wants to probe Andy's mind further, and I see Julia Calvin does.
Andy, what year was Lincoat rebuilt?
It was rebuilt in 1926. It was burned in 1915 or so, and was dormant for a while.
Can you use the microphone and repeat the question?
The house Lincoat burned in 1915, and it lay dormant for a number of years. And painters and sculptors, painters would go up there and paint it. Homer Ellerson went up there and painted the ruins of Lincoat. People would go up there for picnics, and then in 1926, my grandmother, Emma's daughter, bought the property from the trust and built the new Lincoat there in 1926. Thank you.
We have one back here.
John.
Yeah, John.
John.
Anything about the Washburn estate?
The Washburns were a family that moved down here from, I think, Minnesota, and built a property down here. And there are some of those folks that came, I don't know exactly when they came down here, but they were some of the people who were attracted down here the same way the Erskines were. They came down here and had an impact on the community. And that house that is on the outskirts of Lynn, around which those large pine trees are, burned at some point, but the Washburn family still has some presence here because John Washburn owns that cane brake field down across from the tomato fields. He's a descendant of that Washburn clan.
When did Carol Pickens Rogers move into Lincoat? How
Carol,
did that happen?
okay, Carol Pickens Rogers, Senior, my grandfather, who had a relationship with Shields when Shields was in high school, I think, and had an impact on Charles. He was married to Emma's daughter. Emma's daughter was Susan, who was my grandmother, and they married in 1911, and then had several children. My uncle Carol Rogers, who some of you knew, who was a member of this church and died here in 2019 at the age of 107. And my mom and my aunt, Emma, and so Susan was married to Carol Rogers Sr. in 1911. Emma also had several other children, one of whom was Ralph Erskine, who I mentioned in my talk, and that is Chris's grandfather, Chris Bartle's grandfather, Ralph Erskine. Was the person whose first wife died as a result of blood poisoning, couldn't be cured because there was no penicillin, and she was a member of the Payne family, which is also a bunch of people that came down from Chicago. They were editors of the Chicago Tribune, and they came down here because of Emma. They were best friends with Emma and moved down here, and some of their children even intermarried, the Erskine family and the Payne family.
So they moved into the house in 1926, is that right? Your grandparents?
My grandparents moved into the restored Lincoat in 1926. Yes.
Andy, the suspense is killing me. Did her son ever respond to his mother?
Yes, he would respond. See, the reason I was reading those things because I found in my attic, I told you I went to my attic and researched the paper, there's a file this thick of correspondence between Emma and her son Ralph, who is Chris's grandfather. These turgid, impassioned letters that she would write on her typewriter to Ralph, asking him to give the property back, and she would also send them to Susan, my grandmother, and anybody else that would listen about the fact she wanted the property back. And you could tell the intensity of that, but they had to maintain their relationship with her mother, which was very difficult in that situation. At that time, Ralph's, Chris's grandfather was running a furniture company, Danner's Furniture Company up in Connecticut, and just doing all he could to do that, and had to deal with his mom, impassioned letters. But he would write her back and say, "No, we're not doing that." But she had some choice words about the guy that was running the bank. She hated his guts. She thought he was a total nebbish and held him responsible for the fact that the studio burned and burned up her piano, and the piano wasn't insured. She never let it. I think we can probably let people enjoy the refreshments back here, Dick.
This is an old story about trust offices and banks and people like your great-grandmother. It goes on. I want to say one more thing. Heather Brady, stand up. Wave to the crowd. This is one of our volunteers and board members, Heather Brady, who is our membership chairman now. We are launching a membership drive. We are proud of the fact that we are making history accessible. That's what this event's been about today. That's what the museum's about. We want to make history accessible to everyone with no admission charge. So if you would like to join the museum, please see Heather. We're starting a membership campaign, but this is the advance warning of it right now. We'll kick it off at this moment. I want to thank everybody, board members, other volunteers who assisted with the program today. Thank Andy again. Our next presentation is going to be in mid-November. I'm not going to tell you a date right now because it's a little bit up in there, but it's going to be the Douglas family. Ellen Douglas is here with us today, and I don't see any other members of the family right off. But Ellen and her brother Strat have worked with me on getting some material together. They're doing most of it themselves. One of them is going to be one or more members of the Douglas family are going to be the speakers, but it's going to pertain to the history of medicine in Tryon, centered around their grandfather, Dr. Marion Palmer. Tryon has had a lot of medical history, more than ever dreamed. So this will be a very revealing, rewarding session. Keep you up to date on it. We will keep you posted, but that will be about the middle of November. And that will conclude our 2025 season. We're looking forward to 26. Thank you all. Is there anything else I didn't say?
Yes.
Well, okay, Wanda, she has had the last word. I need it.
I have something for Andy.
Oh, well, Andy has the book. I'll give you another copy.
I'll take it.
Good. Whatever you got. I don't know whether you wear a ball cap, but take that one too. Okay. Ball caps and bow ties. I don't know. Okay.